Well, hi everyone. I see that it's 1 o'clock here in Central Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. But I know that there might be some that are still logging on here. My name is Jenny Parker, and I'm the coordinator for all things CSTP related. So if this is your first time at one of our networking calls, welcome. We're so glad that you're joining us today. And if you've been one of our faithful CSTP members coming to all of these calls, welcome as well. So glad you came back. I do have just a couple of quick things that I'm going to pop in the chat here, just some helpful links for people, especially if you are one of our new names or faces. We have first a contact form. So if you are not already on our list for newsletters and these call invites, you can fill out your information and you'll get automatically put on our distribution list. And you'll just get newsletter quarterly, our quarterly conference call invite, and then invites to our networking call, which I'll talk about in a second. And then if you are someone that would like to present at one of these conference calls, I'm always looking for people to present. Or if talking in front of a group isn't really your thing, I'm always looking for submissions to our newsletter. And so you can fill out the next form. It's just a submission form. And that just goes to me. It's not a ironclad agreement. It's not 100%. You have to, do this. It just gives me a little note to say, let's reach out to you and maybe see what you're interested in or what your ideas are. And just tells me that maybe you'd like a little bit more information. So if you have a topic that you'd like to share in one way or another, or you'd be willing to share about what's going on in your department or your state, it's always recommended that you fill out that form. The next link is for our next CSTP networking call, which is a little bit different than these conference calls. For these conference calls, we have sort of a formal presentation with a presenter who's kind of sharing information the whole time. The networking calls are even more laid back. There's no formal presentation. There's no presenter. It's just a time for us all to log on and share kind of what's going on in our departments. If you are wanting to know what other people are doing in their areas or agencies, you can kind of bring those questions to the group. And it's just a nice little 1 hour check-in for people to just kind of share, especially if you are having, something new coming up and you'd like to get some advice. I know a big one has been like updating all of those systems that everyone's been using. And so there's been a lot of that discussion as well, or just getting advice on especially issues pertaining to training. So I always recommend people join those networking calls. They're a lot of fun, and we're actually going to start offering those instead of just quarterly. We're going to do those a couple times per quarter. So instead of once every 3 months, it'll be every other month, which I think will be really nice. And then lastly, if you, again, are new and you haven't seen our newsletters or conference calls before, I've got the last 2 links in there where you can look at kind of our archives. So the newsletter archive will show all of our past newsletters, the conference call, all of these past recordings. And so that can be really helpful, even if you've attended one and you were like, wait, what was that one section that they talked about? You can find the recordings there. So those are all my sort of little introduction and announcements for things. I'm so glad you're all here, and I hope I'll see you at our next networking call. But for now, I'm excited to hand it over to Mindy. So let me know if you have any questions in the chat, and I'll hand it over to Mindy.
Hi everyone, my name is Mindy Hawks. I'm taking half a minute here to adjust my screens. And if I could get confirmation that you are seeing my title slide that I'm sharing that says WCAG and accessibility on it, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so as I said, my name is Mindy Hawks. I am a training specialist with the Washington State Division of Child Support, and I am joined by my teammate, Debbie Faulkner. So I want to say thanks to Debbie for joining me for this presentation. While I'm presenting, she's going to help monitor the hands raised and the chat stream. And speaking of features in Zoom, if you haven't checked your mute button, please do. We're getting just a bit of background noise, so double check that. And then if there are times that you want to jump in and ask a question, please do feel free to unmute. Or if you prefer to raise your hand and speak up, you can go that route as well. I also want to invite you to check out the feature in Zoom to turn on your live captions. So in your Zoom menu, there is a more icon with the 3 dots. And if you click on that, the very top option on my list is called captions. And if you click on that, it will give you the option to show captions. That is a way for you to have live text captions during this presentation. If you want to test it out and realize it's not something you need or not for you, you can turn it off the same way. So thank you again for your time, and thank you for your interest in web content accessibility guidelines, also known as WCAG. And we're going to talk some about general accessibility as well. Thank you also to Jenny for asking us to bring this topic to the group. My hope for today is that you grow your awareness and your knowledge of WCAG and accessibility and how it relates to your life. And I say life because we think you'll find some ways for it to relate to your work and hopefully integrate some of those ways into the work that you do. And one thing we've experienced in our team is the more that we learn about and integrate WCAG and accessibility into our work, the more that we see it in life every day all around us. And not only ways that things are being made accessible in the world around us, but also ways that they need to be made more accessible. So that increased awareness stretches into our life as well, and not just something that we see in the frame of our work. We want to share the PowerPoint that we're going to go through today and a resource summary with you. So Deb, when you have a minute, if you could add those links to the chat, that would be awesome. And then we recommend that you download a copy so you have a copy of your own locally, and then you can make any edits or adaptations that you want to it. They are both located in Dropbox. So when they open in the top right of the Dropbox browser that they open in, there should be a little download icon. Okay, so let's get going. I'm going to ask for you to join me in imagining. Imagine that you signed up to attend some kind of virtual training or event, and maybe you had to get some special approval, and maybe your work agreed to pay for it, and that's not the easiest thing to have done. And the topic is one you really need. It really relates to your work. You think it could have a really good impact. You cleared your schedule. So what I'm getting at is it's something you really care about. It's an important thing that you've signed up for, that you've been really intentional about attending. And imagine that you log on to the virtual platform to attend this event you're so excited about. And this is the first slide that you see. So at the top of the slide, it says, "Welcome to training. As you arrive, please add to chat." It's on this bright kind of yellow mustardy background. And maybe you feel a little confused. What do you want me to add to chat? So in this scenario, what do you do? Maybe you see some folks in chat either adding some things. But how do you feel in this scenario? What do you do in this scenario? Please add to chat, or if you want, just unmute and share a bit. How are you feeling if you are experiencing this? Yeah, maybe you're paying attention to what other people are adding, and that's kind of tipping you off about something, but maybe, yeah, you're feeling confused. And you're wondering what you're missing that other people might seem to be getting. Thank you for adding some ideas to chat. So in this example, we are, yeah, maybe you're asking some questions about the chat feature. You're wondering whether you have the virtual training or meeting platform that everyone else does, but there's something that you feel like is missing. So this is what someone with red-green color deficit, often called color blindness, may see. And I say may see because the perception of color is pretty subjective, but about 4.5% of the world population experience some type of color blindness. And so now let's look side by side for what the event facilitator in this imaginary scenario intended everyone to see. So now on the left-hand side of the screen, there is this peach-orange background with the same text, but this additional question in green that says, please add to chat this prompt, your name, where you're from, and one of your strengths as a trainer. So same slide. On the left, what someone who doesn't experience red-green color blindness would perceive. On the right, what someone who does experience red-green color blindness and what they may perceive. And so this scenario is really just intended to show how different folks' experiences can be when they experience one form of a disability, color blindness being the example we're using. And color blindness, like other disabilities, may be more common than you realize. 2023 statistics from the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, estimated that 27% of adults in the US have some form of disability. So for a training group, for example, of about 35 adults, that's 9 people who could benefit from us as trainers and content creators and facilitators, from us taking steps to make our training more accessible, whether it's virtual instructor-led training or in-person training or online training. So in this scenario, the event facilitator making sure that the colors they used were WCAG compliant would have alleviated the visual barrier for people who experience color blindness. So there's a link to a CDC infographic if you're interested. I'm going to ask Debbie to please add that to chat. And we have quite a few resources that we'll share throughout training today. There's also in one of the Dropbox items, one of those resources is a resource summary. So that is intended to be something you can download, you can adapt and add to, and not in any way a fully comprehensive list of resources, but a starting place if that's what you need in terms of WCAG and accessibility. So visual disabilities, like color blindness, they're just one example of a disability that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, are designed to address. And we're going to talk a bit more about WCAG in terms of definitions here in a minute. But first, I would really love to learn more about where you think you are, or what your current understanding, awareness, what your knowledge is of WCAG and accessibility. So on the slide, there's an option to respond based on this 1 to 5 scale. So 1 is like you're just starting out. Maybe today is where you're starting. Great, we're glad you're here. 2, maybe you're just starting to build your awareness, but today is not the first time you've heard this word WCAG. Maybe you're more at a 3, you're building your awareness, you're starting to integrate some strategies into some training deliverables. Maybe you're kind of a step past that at a 4, where you're integrating some strategies into most all of your training deliverables. And maybe you are at a 5, you're proactively embedding WCAG and accessibility into everything that you do. So if you would add to the chat 1 to 5, or we have time for a couple of people to unmute and share if you want to share a bit more about where you are. Awesome. I'm seeing a couple 1s, a couple 2s, a couple 3s, a couple 4s. We have folks placed all along the road in this WCAG and accessibility journey. Thank you for sharing. And so one thing I'm really excited about, seeing so many 3s and some 4s, is seeing each other as resources, is understanding each other as resources. And so I sent the resource summary, and at the end, we'll have some time blocked out for questions. And I really hope that those that are further along in their journey are prepared or willing to share some resources or some lessons learned with the rest of the group so that we can start today adding to that resource summary that we shared. And if there are resources not in there, I'm sure there are many that you've found really helpful and useful in your work. You can add them to the chat or unmute and speak to them at that time. So just a heads up and a pre-invitation to be prepared for that. Here in a bit, we'll end with a Q&A and some time for resource sharing. Okay, thanks everyone. So let's review some definitions. Accessibility is designing products, services, devices, and environments so that they're usable by people with disabilities and accessibility needs. And Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, as you'll commonly hear it referred, is an international standard and guidelines for making web-based and virtual content accessible to people with disabilities and accessibility needs. So you can think of WCAG as a part of accessibility, but specifically focusing on web-based and virtual content. So question for you, in the different training environments that you work in, what kinds of web-based or virtual content do you use? And again, please add to chat, or if you want to unmute and speak up, please do. What kind of web-based and virtual content do you use? This could be in your in-person training or your virtual instructor-led training. Yeah, this kind of feels like a trick question, right? It could be anything. Think broadly. Yes, PowerPoint. So even PowerPoint is an example of this. And for many people, are probably primary ways that we use electronic or virtual content, especially in virtual instructor-led training. But also think about in-person training. If you're providing a copy of that PowerPoint to your learners, you're often providing it as maybe an attachment before or after training and not necessarily handing them a packet of your whole slide deck. Yes, some great ideas in chat. So we have e-learning, different applications that we might invite our learners to use. Videos, yes, and other types of multimedia, different kind of supplemental engagement tools like Terry, I think Minty is Mentimeter. Cahoots is what I haven't heard of. Very fun to say. Thank you for sharing that tool. Yes, great examples. Thank you for all your contributions. And hopefully this is reinforcing that we use so much web-based, virtual, electronic content and information resources in training, whether it's virtual, instructor-led, e-learning. There are so many different ways that we ask our learners to engage web-based, virtual, and electronically. So web content accessibility guidelines would apply to all of those things. In any of those ways of engaging, there's the potential that folks who experience disabilities could really struggle if we're not taking steps to make all of those things accessible. And there are some strategies that we can use to do that. So it just makes sense, and I think you would agree, it just makes sense to provide people with information in a way they can understand. And it's also our legal responsibility in the same way that we're required to provide ADA parking. So I want to just bring your attention to a very brief timeline of some of the primary laws that govern accessibility, including web accessibility in the United States. Thanks, Deb. Deb added a link to the chat. So I'm just going to quickly review this slide. We have the Rehabilitation Act here in 1973, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1999, commonly referred to as the ADA. We have Section 508, which is an amendment to the Rehabilitation Act, which came out in 1998, a pretty significant date in terms of when the internet was becoming much more widely used and available and commonplace in people's lives and work. And so virtual accessibility, web-based accessibility became something we had to think a lot more about. WCAG, the first iteration, was released in 1999. And then there are also some state level policy agreements or guidance that might be at play in your state that you want to consider as well. So that's something I recommend you explore further. For example, in Washington State, we have OCIO, which stands for the Office of the Chief. The Office of the Cheese. I would like to be a part of that office. The Office of the Chief Information Officer. So OCIO Policy 188 sets the expectation for state agencies here in Washington to provide accessible electronic content and information to people with disabilities. So you might have some kind of state level legal requirement as well that you would want to be aware of. We won't get into a lot of detail on this, but I just wanted to do a brief overview and then also introduce you, if you're not already aware, to the fact that there are these different versions of WCAG and levels of conformance, meaning to what extent you're making something accessible. And part of why that's important is because the different legal requirements that exist often identify what level of conformance needs to be met for us to be meeting our legal requirement. So for example, Title III of the ADA and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act reference WCAG 2.0 AA, which is a version of WCAG and a level of conformance in terms of the A. However, your state policy, it might build on that. So in Washington State, ours sets a higher standard than at the federal level, where it says we actually need to meet 2.1 AA. So Debbie added a link to the WCAG guidelines to the chat, but I would also like to offer the disclaimer that we hardly ever, and in my notes I have this in all capitals, hardly ever do we use them directly as a resource. They can be pretty complicated to make easily understandable dependent on the scope of your work. And so we rely more heavily on user-friendly tools and resources that relate more easily to the work that we do. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute, see if you have any questions or thoughts that you might want to add. If anyone is aware of a different state level standard and wants to share that in chat, I'm interested to hear. I'll pause for just a sec before I move on. Okay. All right, so knowing about different types of disabilities helps us better understand the needs that we're addressing. And we talked briefly about color blindness. I want to introduce one way of categorizing disabilities, which is into these 4 groups. This is how a leading resource for web accessibility does it. That resource is called WebAIM, and we'll add that link to the chat as well. And that's one that shows up quite a bit in the resource summary that we linked. So 4 categories here, and as I just do a quick overview of them, I invite you to think about how the training you provide, whatever it is, whether it's creating cheat sheets and e-learning, in-person training, virtual instructor-led training, whatever it is, think about how you provide, think about whatever it is you provide and how it may be experienced differently by somebody who has a disability than somebody who doesn't. So in the top left, we have visual disabilities. So blindness, low vision, color blindness. Auditory disabilities include deafness and hard of hearing. And, you know, there is, I would say, a lot of nuance and Deafness and hard of hearing does not, of course, completely capture the experience of auditory disabilities. Those are just two of the primary examples. Motor disabilities often include the inability to use a mouse, slow response time, maybe limited fine motor control. And those could be like traumatic injuries, loss or damage to a limb, some diseases like cerebral palsy or Parkinson's, and severe arthritis. Cognitive disabilities can create learning disabilities, can often impact attention and create distractibility, inability to remember or focus on large amounts of information. And these are by far the most common type of disability in the United States. Almost 13% of the population have some form of cognitive disability. So this includes things like autism, attention deficit disorders, dyslexia, traumatic brain injuries, and types of mental health disorders like anxiety and depression. So next, we are going to review a few examples of some common strategies. So we talked about the what and the why, and now we're going to shift into the how. And I want to say that we really don't have time. Many of you who are more deeply involved in WCAG and accessibility know that it's really hard to get much into strategies in an hour-long presentation. So we're going to focus on a couple examples with the invitation to learn more. And hopefully you learn something new, and hopefully that piques your interest to keep learning. So in this first scenario, we have a scenario based on visual disability. So imagine that you're creating an online training, an e-learning, and you're lucky enough to create online training with super cute dogs in it. So imagine you're creating an online training and you want to include an activity for people to match these images of dogs with their breeds. In this scenario, thinking specifically about visual disabilities, how can we make this more accessible? So it's currently set up as this activity where you drag the dog to the breed or the breed to the dog. What ideas do you have about how we could make this more accessible, or barriers, problems that folks with visual disabilities might have when they got to this activity in the e-learning? Please add to chat, or if you want to raise your hand or just unmute and jump in, I always welcome that. So how can we make this more accessible for our learners with visual disabilities? You're awesome. Yeah, so a couple of examples here coming up in chat. Describe the features of the dog instead of relying just on the image. Yeah, which is a really great example of alternative text. And I thank you, Diane, for bringing that element in. So alternative text is a textual description of a non-text element. So these images of dogs being an example of a non-text element, someone with a visual disability wouldn't be able to perceive this image of this dog unless we added some textual descriptions called alternative text or alt text. Bigger images, change color of dog name circles. If someone is blind, they cannot participate. Different colors, white font on yellow would be hard to see. Yes, better contrast on text. Wonderful, you guys are hitting some of the main things I hoped you would. And so one thing that's coming up in the chat, I appreciate you drawing folks' attention to, is color contrast. So this ties back to our example for color blindness. WCAG guidelines say that there needs to be a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. So a text color, the white text on the slide in this example that lists the dog breeds, and the background color, there needs to be a high enough contrast between those two colors. Because I designed this slide, I know there isn't, so I built it in that way. So thank you for drawing our attention to that. And I don't think I have time to demo it. Actually, so let me get a gauge from the group. Thanks, Debbie. Debbie added a really awesome color contrast checker tool called Tanaguru. If others have different ones they use, please feel free to add them to chat. Who here would like me to it'll probably take about 5 minutes to demonstrate how to test color contrast in Tanaguru. And who maybe is already familiar with that and would prefer to spend our time elsewhere. The number was 4.5 to 1. Interested in the demo? Sure. Okay. Yeah, no problem, Kathy. Okay, let's do the demo. So to be able to test contrast between two colors, we need to be able to quantify the color. A way to easily do that is with a red, green, blue code, and PowerPoint is a really helpful tool for doing that. So I'm actually going to drag my PowerPoint over here. And if you're aware of the eyedropper tool, that's the tool that we're going to use. So basically you need to find anywhere to pull up a color picker. So I could click here, text colors or shape colors. It doesn't really matter where. I'm just borrowing the tool from PowerPoint. So anywhere that there's a color picker that our color palette will pop up, we'll also find this eyedropper tool. And if I click on my eyedropper tool, then anywhere I hover on the slide, it's going to give me the RGB code. So if I just pause for a sec, it'll give me my RGB. So this is the way that we're going to quantify our colors. And this is what we need to do in order to use our color contrast checker. So let's get the code for this golden orange color. So I know it's itty bitty for you. I'm writing it on my notepad, 233, 177, and 0. And then this white text, I know it's 255, 255, 255, just from doing this a couple times. So I'm going to speed it up by just knowing that white is 255 times 3. And then if you want to follow along with me, you can pull up Tanaguru. Debbie added the link to the chat. And so now we just add our colors into this nifty tool. So our foreground color was white. So I'm going to go 255, hit tab, 255, hit tab, and 255, and then hit tab again. And now our foreground color has adjusted to white. And then our background color was gold. So 233, yes, tab 177, tab 0. And that's our gold color. And then I'm going to hit enter, but first I just want to draw your attention to, in case you're like, how do I ever remember 4.5 to 1? You don't have to. If you use this tool, it will automatically check for that minimum contrast standard for you. So that's what is being referenced here with the minimum ratio. If you need a higher contrast, like 3.1, you can use a little bit different level of contrast with different sizes of text is what it says in our WCAG guidelines. Then you can use this drop down to identify a different level, but our default is this 4.5 to 1. So I'm going to hit enter. And it doesn't look like it's doing much, but here in the tab, it scrolled, so it was thinking. And then if I scroll down, it is now telling me that the ratio of this white text on a gold background is 1.9. So not what we need it to be, not high enough. So another cool feature about this is that it has a way for us to say, it didn't meet our standard, recommend some colors for me that do meet the 4.5 to 1 minimum standard. So in the example with the dogs on the slide, I think it would probably be easier to adjust the background color. So I'm going to toggle over to edit background color. And then I'm going to ask it to give me a range of valid colors because I don't care so much about keeping it in that golden scale. And now if I scroll down, it has recommended a lot of other alternative colors that I could use, keeping my white text. that all in this column show at least a 4.5 to 1 minimum contrast ratio. And so if I wanted to use this red, I would just note the RGB for the red, and then I could update my PowerPoint to that color, and I would know that it met our contrast standard. I know that was pretty quick, but any questions about those couple steps of testing for color contrast using Tanagaroo? Or what other tools do you use? Folks that are doing this more often, folks that are testing contrast as a part of their business practices. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, it's a handy tool. Yeah, no problem, Katie. Okay, let me drag my PowerPoint back. So another thing that you all brought up was alternative text. So these dogs, for example, you were spot on, they would need alternative text in order to be meaningful for folks with a visual disability, as would any non-text element. And one of the reasons we add alternative text is because often folks with visual disabilities and other types of disabilities use different forms of assistive technology. So screen readers are just, screen readers are just one example of a type of assistive technology. There is a link to a person who is blind demonstrating how they use their screen reader in your resource overview. If you're not familiar with that form of assistive technology, it's a really helpful video to better understand screen readers and what that experience is like for someone with a visual disability who uses one. So invitation to check that out. It's just a couple minutes long. And one of the things that a screen reader does is when it gets to a non-text element, like a picture of a chocolate lab, it would read the alternative text assigned to it. So then it's up to us as designers to add alternative text to non-text elements that are meaningful for a learner to understand. So if you download a copy of this PowerPoint, you'll be able to view the alternative text or read here the alternative text that I've added. For this one, it says large size hunting and family dog, typically found in shades of brown, black, or gold, and known for being easygoing and good-natured. So, as you might sense from me sharing that example, alternative text can be kind of subjective, and it's largely dependent on context. So there's some more alternative text resources in the resource summary as well, if you're interested in learning more. Someone else noted in the chat, I think someone noted this interaction, drag and drop. Yes, thank you, Annie. So this type of interaction, drag and drop, is, I was going to say never. Maybe there are some really advanced programs out there, but in my experience, I've never seen a drag and drop that is accessible. And the reason for that is because I have to use my mouse to click on Chocolate Lab here, hold down my mouse, drag it over to Lab, and then let go. And anything that requires a use of a mouse is not WCAG compliant. So keyboard only accessibility, keyboard only navigation is really important for accessibility. Things that we create and design have to be able to be navigated by just the keyboard and only in order to be accessible. Does that make sense? How did that piece land? Any questions about that? Okay. There's some other things going on here. Along with keyboard accessibility, we would need to adjust what's called tab order, or if you're a Storyline and Articulate Suite user, it's called focused order in Storyline. But basically telling screen readers and types of assistive technology what order to move through elements on a slide. It's really important for us to do as designers. So someone using assistive technologies, they don't get to this slide and it first goes to poodle, and then it goes to this image of a Havanese, and then it goes to corgi, and then it goes to Australian Shepherd. it moves in a logical and intuitive order for how the slide was designed to be interpreted. Okay, let's talk about a auditory disability example next. So next scenario, imagine that you are delivering this time a virtual instructor-led training. And in that training, you want to play a short video and then discuss it as a group. So in this scenario, there's a Teams frame. So imagine you're delivering your virtual instructor-led training through Teams. And there is on the slide within the Teams screen frame, there is a person in a wheelchair who appears to be actively delivering a TED Talk presentation. For learners with auditory disabilities, what things would we need to pay attention to? How could we make this experience more accessible? What ideas do you have about that? And again, feel free to add to the chat or unmute and jump in. Yes, captions. Yeah, closed captions are a big piece of it. So I would recommend only using videos and multimedia that have captions, or if there's a transcript available that you could provide ahead of time. And this also kind of speaks to the best practice of introducing accessibility needs, requesting information about accessibility needs before training. So in your emails or in your communication to folks before you have them in your trainings, asking about what types of accessibility needs or accommodations they might have. And of course, it's on us to always do as good a job as we can with making things accessible, and embedding that feedback into your process can also be really helpful. And so if someone's like, I need captions, or I learn better when I can read things. I just don't, auditory comprehension is not my zone. It's not a strength of mine. Then we can come prepared with a transcript that we can share with people ahead of time or in the moment, if for some reason captions aren't available. But as a good best practice, only use videos and multimedia that have the ability to turn on captions. Okay. Let me check my notes real quick. Also, make it a best practice to understand the accessibility features in the virtual instructor-led training platform you're using. We use Teams a lot, and so we always start by helping people know that there's the option to turn on live captions. And we try to make sure that there's not just one way of doing something. So if we're doing a whiteboard, which has some issues with accessibility, we also invite people to add to the chat. If we are asking people a question for group discussion, we also make sure we add that question to the chat, or we have it presented on the slide so people have a reference point for it in different ways. Okay, let's talk briefly about some best practices for people who experience motor disabilities. So there's no scenario for this one, just a couple things to consider. Again, keyboard navigation is really important. So ensuring that whether it's a PowerPoint or a Word document or a PDF or an e-learning that you developed, that somebody could navigate the whole thing with just use of their keyboard. And so tab order comes into play here again, where we're being thoughtful and intentional about the things happening in the background. We've structured our tab order or our focus order in a way that someone using assistive technology or keyboard only navigation is going to move through the elements in the way that the training or the deliverable was designed for it to be moved through. And then also think about physical accessibility. If you do in-person training or if you do event planning, there are a couple resources in your resource summary for that as well. So really build that into your process if it isn't already. Most facilities will have things like ADA accessible restrooms and parking. And if you can, do a site tour and envision how somebody who experiences different types of disabilities might navigate that space differently and be proactive about building those steps into your process. Okay, and then finally, let's talk about WCAG and accessibility for cognitive disabilities. So again, not a scenario here, but we invite you to consider keeping things simple and consistent. So limiting stylized animations or transitions in PowerPoint and effects. The WCAG guidelines actually have a very specific requirement for how often things can flash or strobe because of the risk, the danger for seizure disorders. Also use built-in templates as much as you can. It not only helps with consistent visual layout, but often there's functionality built into the background of templates in Word and PowerPoint and Storyline e-learning that have some of these accessibility features already in place. So for example, using a template for this PowerPoint presentation, I just type in my words cognitive disability in my title header placeholder, and someone using a screen reader would know that that's a title. Their screen reader would help them understand automatically that that's the title of this slide. If I added a text box, that's not going to be true. Try to minimize non-literal communication. This is hard for me sometimes because I think I'm funny, but use of sarcasm, idioms, allegory, metaphor, colloquialisms, those things can be difficult for people with cognitive disabilities, with some cognitive disabilities to understand. They can be really distracting. Provide clear instructions in multiple ways. Use fonts thoughtfully, especially for people who experience dyslexia. This is a big one. I spoke to strobing and flashing effects. And then just as a best practice, don't volunteer people to read aloud. Invite volunteers to read if you want to try and shake things up by not hearing your own voice, clear slides. Invite folks to help out by reading. And usually you'll get a volunteer. Okay, let's briefly touch on some inclusive language do's and don'ts, and then we'll shift into questions. So here are some examples of things that we may say in learning and development, and I'll pause for half a minute so you have a chance to review them. And if anyone prefers that I read them aloud, please let me know. I'm happy to. So one thing I personally struggle with is this bullet about 2/3 of the way down. As you can see on the slide, I've gotten in the habit of saying that because it, I think, minimizes that it can be redundant, that I'm reading something they're seeing on the slide. And it's ableist. It assumes the experience that everyone can see, that everyone has sight. And so that's something that I'm personally working on. Here are some examples of things that you could try instead. And this is not in any way intended to make you feel shame or bad if you recognize that one of these examples is something that you say or do or something similar. It's really just a way for us to build our awareness and to keep evolving our language and to make conscious choices about the language that we use. And I know that many of us are doing that in different parts of our lives in different ways. And so this is an invitation to consider it in the scope of our training as well. And there are some more examples of inclusive language best practices and some resources in your resource guide too. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I want to carve out some time for questions. So what questions do you have? And what resources do you use that you would like to share with the group, either by adding to chat or unmuting and sharing a resource that you find really valuable, or maybe a lesson learned that has stood out to you as you embedded WCAG and accessibility more into your work and your life.
Hey, this is Angie from Indiana, and I just had a question about the time that it takes to prepare and make sure that you check for all of this. Let's say that you're preparing a 1 hour Teams session. How long would you expect, or how much time do you build in to do these checks and make sure you're meeting the standards?
Yeah, good question. And everyone's favorite answer, it depends. It really, in my experience, depends on the programs that you're using and kind of what stage you're in. After you're more in the routine of WCAGing things, we like to use WCAG as a verb. After you're more in the routine of WCAGing things, it's really something that you'll do as you design something. And so the time gets shorter and shorter, and the more that you embed it into your process. So for example, for a lot of our instructor-led trainings, we'll send a series of emails ahead of time, and we have drafted templates that it really just takes copying and pasting that template. By embedding WCAG and accessibility steps into those processes, it really cuts down on the time. But I will be very honest, it is absolutely an additional time commitment. To add alternative text to every non-text element, to maybe design slides a little differently, stretch things out over more slides. Because for example, with tab order, if you have too many elements on a single slide, it can get complicated and sometimes impossible for them to be ordered in the way that you intend for them to be ordered and not mess up the visual appearance of the slide. And so for an hour, other folks who do this, and especially if you had a 3 in that initial question, what would you say? What's your opinion for an hour training? What's the extra time add? And members of my team as well who are here. What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious what our group average might be. My initial thought is that it probably takes another half an hour to 45 minutes. Yeah, thanks, Julie. Other people have their calculators out tabulating the amount of time for the different steps. Yeah, we also kind of use, well, I'm sure the phrase came from somewhere, but we say often design with accessibility in mind, because once you have these elements that you're automatically thinking about as you design, you do really design with accessibility in mind. And that of course cuts down on some of the steps that are taken after your quote done, after your draft is done. Yeah, thanks, Terry. Would you say that it becomes more of a natural occurrence after a while? I think that it does, especially if you're being intentional about embedding it into your processes. And there are some things that I am just consistently working on, and every single day at some point I say the word see, and then I have this internal monologue of don't default to C as everyone's primary experience. And then I try to say a different word. You probably heard me do it just in this presentation. So there are always things I think that we'll find we're going to be working on, and it does get easier the more that these become habits.
Yeah, and Mindy, this is Debbie.
Yeah, thanks.
I do a lot what Dave does. I try to incorporate it as I go. And I think a lot of the things that take time is the alt text on pictures. But if you don't have, if your picture isn't of value for someone who's not sighted, like it's not there for them to learn, then just putting the double parentheses on it goes really fast. So I think that it just all depends on your system. But once you start doing it, I think you get used to it. It'll go a lot faster.
Thank you so much for adding that, Debbie. So you only need alternative text on non-text elements if they add value. If it's a purely decorative image, like this question mark on the slide, I have the alternative text with just a double quotation, and then if a screen reader got to this, it would just skip over it. It would recognize it as an element that it doesn't need to address. And we're using an older version of Microsoft PowerPoint. If you have a newer version, I'm pretty sure it has a really spiffy box that you just check and it says decorative element or decorative feature. If someone is using a newer version than me and can confirm that, thank you, Claudia. Awesome. So it's wonderful that WCAG is getting more common because programs that we use are getting better and better at embedding these steps into their functionality. There are some resources on ableism in your resource guide as well. So this quote from Haben Girma, who's a lawyer and a disability rights advocate, says, "The biggest challenge is ableism, not my disability." So an invitation to learn more about ableism as well, if it's something that you're not immediately familiar with. And then I would like to share one more quote before we say goodbye. And that is, "When everything works, my blindness is just a fact of life, not an insurmountable obstacle blocking my path." And that's a quote by Georgina Klieg, who's a writer and professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And I actually got that quote from a book called The Country of the Blind by Andrew Leland. And it's about his experience of going blind throughout his lifetime. And it's a really great read if you're interested in a book recommendation. But I mostly just wanted to end with this quote so I could encourage you a call to action or another invitation to help make things work in the work that you do for folks with disabilities, and really see this as a necessary and normal part of our process as e-learning designers and trainers, and not a big extra added step. Thank you so much for all of your time. I really appreciate your time and your contributions. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And the PowerPoint and the Word document were added to chat. If for some reason you have trouble accessing them, let us know. But they're really for you. So if you think, I want to take this and change it and deliver it this other place, more power to you. Do what you will with it, adapt it however to best meet your needs. All right, thanks so much, everyone. I hope you have a great Leap Day. I'll hand back to Jenny.
Well, thank you so much, Mindy and Debbie. This was an excellent presentation. I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat showing their appreciation for you both as well. There was a lot of great, excellent information, and I'm excited to share some of those resources that you provided, especially that color contrast reader with my teammates as well. I think, wow, what a great resource to be able to use. So thanks again to everybody for joining our call today. I hope that it was helpful for you. I'll make sure to provide the recording on our online so that you can go back and review it, and let me know if you have any questions or need any of these links or resources added. I can always shoot those your way as well. So thank you both so much again. That was really, really excellent.